A rich man tosses coins at a homeless beggar, laughing, unaware that the man he's humiliating isn't just anyone. He's Big Shaq, a forgotten name from the past, a silent storm waiting to strike. By the time the truth unfolds, fortunes will crumble, reputations will shatter, and one man will learn a brutal lesson. Some people aren't just down, they're waiting to rise. Because the streets, they never forget. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from. Share in the comments below. The city was alive, but it wasn't warm. The sun stretched lazily across the skyline, bouncing off steel and glass, but its light couldn't reach the places that mattered. The streets below told a different story, one of forgotten people and faded dreams. Pedestrians moved in rhythm, lost in their own worlds, stepping over broken sidewalks and past unseen faces, their minds elsewhere. In the middle of it all, a man stood out like royalty among commoners. Big Shaq. Dressed in a tailored three-piece suit, charcoal gray with a silk black shirt underneath, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had built something out of nothing. His diamond watch peeked out from beneath his sleeve, catching the sunlight in a way that made people stare. Yet, despite the wealth he wore, there was something about him that didn't belong in the world of the elite. Maybe it was the way he walked, steady but not arrogant. Maybe it was the way his eyes didn't pass over the broken pieces of the world but stopped to see them. Shaq had seen too much to ignore what others conveniently overlooked. As he moved through the crowded street, something pulled at him. A feeling, a memory just out of reach. He had been here before, not in this exact spot, but somewhere like it. Back when the world didn't recognize his name. Back when life wasn't this easy. He adjusted his cufflinks, eyes scanning the sidewalks, and that's when he saw it. A man. No, not just a man, a story, folded into himself, sitting on the curb. His clothes hung on him like a forgotten promise, torn and stained, barely clinging to dignity. He was older, his face carved with the kind of lines that only come from losing more than winning. People walked past without looking, without stopping. Shaq had learned long ago that the world had an order, the ones who could afford to be seen, and the ones who were invisible. And then came Preston Hawthorne, tall, sharp-featured, and wrapped in a suit that probably cost more than some people made in a year. Preston moved like he owned everything around him. Because, in his mind, he did. His shoes clicked against the pavement, polished to a fault. But his smile was anything but warm. He stopped in front of the homeless man, tilting his head, as if studying a rare animal behind glass. Well, what do we have here? Preston's voice dripped with amusement, loud enough for those around to hear, but not loud enough to draw real attention. A little out of place, don't you think? The man on the curb barely reacted, only shifting slightly, as if he already knew what was coming. Preston chuckled, shaking his head. Tell me something. Do you enjoy this? Sitting here, waiting for scraps? He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill, waving it in front of the man's face like a toy. Or do you just like the pity? Shaq felt his jaw tighten. It was the kind of cruelty that wasn't loud, wasn't violent, but cut deeper than any fist ever could. He had seen it before, the kind of man who needed to make others feel small, just to remind himself how big he was. The homeless man finally looked up, his eyes hollow but sharp. He stared at the money for a long moment before lifting his gaze to meet Preston's. I don't need your money, he said, voice raspy but firm. Preston laughed, shaking his head in mock disbelief. Oh, is that right? You're too good for it? He tossed the bill at the man's feet, watching as it fluttered against the sidewalk like fallen leaves. Take it. Buy yourself some self-respect. Something inside Shaq twisted. He had seen enough. He stepped forward, his presence commanding without trying. The moment Preston noticed him, his expression flickered, just for a second, before he composed himself. Well, if it isn't the man of the hour, Preston said smoothly. Big Shaq in the flesh. Didn't expect to see you here. Shaq didn't smile, didn't offer his hand. Instead, he glanced down at the bill on the ground, then back at Preston. Didn't expect to see this either. Preston shrugged, unbothered. Just trying to do my part. Some people need a little push. Shaq's gaze hardened. That what you call this? Preston chuckled, but there was an edge to it now. Oh, come on. Don't tell me you're one of those guys who thinks handing out money actually changes anything. I mean, look at him. Look at them. He gestured to the other homeless people lining the street. They're here because they want to be. If they really wanted a better life, they'd work for it. Shaq felt something deep and old rise in him. A familiar anger, not the kind that made you lash out, but the kind that sat in your bones, waiting. He crouched down, ignoring Preston now, focusing only on the man in front of him. What's your name? The homeless man hesitated, as if the question itself was unfamiliar. Finally, he spoke. Leon. Shaq nodded. You good, Leon? Leon let out a breath that sounded more like a laugh. Been better. Been worse. Shaq picked up the $100 bill, brushing the dirt off before holding it out. If you don't want this, that's your call. But don't ever let a man like him tell you what you're worth. Leon stared at him for a long time, before slowly taking the money. Not because he was desperate, but because Shaq had given it differently. Without expectation, without shame. Preston sighed dramatically. Touching, really. But let's be real, Shaq. You think this changes anything? You think this guy is suddenly going to turn his life around because you gave him money instead of me? Shaq stood up, towering over Preston, his expression unreadable. Nah, but I think he'll remember the difference. Preston scoffed, but there was something uncertain in his eyes now. Shaq didn't wait for a response. He turned back to Leon and reached into his pocket, pulling out a sleek black card. You ever decide you want more than just surviving, he said, handing it over. Come find me. Leon took the card carefully, his fingers rough against the smooth plastic. He looked at Shaq, something unreadable in his expression. Why? Shaq held his gaze. Because I've been here before. For the first time, something shifted in Leon's face. Recognition. A flicker of something more. Shaq turned and walked away, leaving Preston standing there, his smirk faltering. The city kept moving. People kept walking. The world didn't stop. But for one man on a forgotten street corner, everything had just changed. The air was thick with indifference, the kind that weighed heavier than the summer heat. People walked past as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening, as if the scene unfolding before them was just another moment in a city that never stopped moving. Shaq stood still, watching. Preston Hawthorne had an audience, and he thrived on it. His laughter carried through the air, sharp and condescending, as he towered over the homeless man at his feet. The city noise didn't drown him out. It amplified him. It made him bigger. Well, go on then, Preston sneered, jingling a handful of coins in his manicured fingers before letting them spill onto the pavement. There's your fortune. The coins clattered, rolling in different directions, some landing in a puddle near the curb, others stopping at the worn soles of the homeless man's shoes. But he didn't move. He didn't reach for them. He just sat there, hunched but not broken, his gaze fixed on a spot far beyond Preston's smirking face. Preston clicked his tongue, shaking his head in exaggerated disappointment. You know, I'm trying to be generous here. Some people would kill for a little help. Shaq's hands curled into loose fists at his sides, not out of anger, not out of some desire to step in and throw his weight around. It wasn't about that. It was about what was happening. About how power worked in moments like these. Not in boardrooms or bank accounts, but in the way one person could strip another of their dignity with just a handful of coins. The homeless man finally looked up. His face was weathered, creased with stories he had no reason to share, but his eyes were sharp, aware. There was no pleading in them, no desperation. Not all wealth is made of gold. His voice was rough, but steady. For the first time, Preston's smirk faltered. What? The homeless man leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, but he didn't break eye contact. You think money makes you better than me? His lips twitched, not in a smile, but something close to it. That's how I know you've never had to fight for it. A few people had stopped walking, sensing something more than just another exchange between the fortunate and the forgotten. Shaq saw it too. Preston let out a short, breathy laugh, but the arrogance in it didn't land quite as hard this time. Oh, is that right? He crouched, bringing himself to the man's level, but still managing to look down on him. You want to tell me what real wealth is then? Enlighten me. The homeless man exhaled slowly, his fingers grazing one of the fallen coins. He picked it up, turned it over in his palm, then tossed it back at Preston's feet. Real wealth isn't something you have to prove. Shaq felt the shift in the air. It was subtle, but it was there. Preston's jaw tightened just enough to be noticeable. That's cute, he said, standing up again, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeves. But let me tell you something. You see that? He pointed at the building behind him, a towering glass structure reflecting the city like a distorted mirror. I own a quarter of that. You see that car? He gestured to the sleek black luxury vehicle parked at the curb. That's mine. And you see this? He held up his watch, tilting it just enough for the sunlight to catch the diamonds encrusted along its edges. This is worth more than your entire existence. Silence. Shaq had heard enough. He stepped forward, slow but deliberate, his presence impossible to ignore. Preston glanced up, his smirk returning, but this time it didn't quite reach his eyes. Well, if it isn't the city's favorite giant. Preston's voice was smooth, but Shaq could hear the slight edge to it now. Here to drop some wisdom? Shaq didn't respond right away. Instead, he bent down and picked up one of the scattered coins, holding it between his fingers. He studied it for a second, then flipped it into the air, catching it effortlessly. His gaze drifted from the coin to the homeless man, then back to Preston. Funny thing about money, Shaq said finally. It only has value because we agree it does. Preston let out a short laugh. That's supposed to mean something? Shaq didn't answer. Instead, he did something no one expected. He pulled out his wallet. But he didn't grab cash. He didn't pull out a crisp bill or a shiny black credit card. He reached for something else, a business card. He crouched down and handed it to the homeless man. Not with pity, not with some grand display, just an offering, a choice. The man looked at it, but didn't take it right away. He studied Shaq, as if searching for a catch. Shaq met his gaze. If you ever want a way out, this is a door. The homeless man's fingers finally curled around the card, his grip light but certain. He looked down at it, then back up at Shaq. Why? Shaq stood up, slipping his wallet back into his pocket. Because I know what it's like to have people look at you and think they already know your story. For the first time, something flickered across the man's face. A recognition. A thread connecting the past to the present. Preston scoffed, breaking the moment. Oh, come on. You think handing out opportunities like charity is going to fix the world? He shook his head, amused. You can't save everyone, Shaq. Shaq looked at him then, really looked. I'm not trying to save everyone, he said. Just the ones who still want to fight. Preston opened his mouth to fire back, but before he could, the homeless man did something no one saw coming. He stood up, slowly, deliberately. Not with the hunched posture of someone beaten down, but with the quiet strength of someone still standing. He pocketed the business card. Then without another word, he turned and walked away. Shaq watched him go, something unreadable in his expression. The crowd that had gathered started to break apart, their attention drifting, but Shaq could feel it. The shift. Preston exhaled, shaking his head in amusement. Well, that was pointless. Shaq turned to him, his gaze steady. You think so? Preston chuckled, giving one last glance at the card resting in the man's pocket before shrugging. He won't call. Shaq's lips barely moved, but there was something almost knowing in his expression. We'll see. And with that, he walked away. The city kept moving. The world kept turning. But for one man walking toward an uncertain future, something had already changed. The city didn't stop moving, not for a single moment. Cars honked, people rushed past, conversations blended into an indistinct hum. But in this tiny pocket of the world, time slowed. The air between them thickened, heavy with something unspoken. Shaq shrugged off his tailored coat, the weight of it shifting as he held it in his hands. The fabric was smooth, the kind of material stitched for boardrooms and red carpets, not for the cracked pavement beneath his feet. It was expensive, obviously so. But at that moment, it wasn't wealth that mattered. It was gesture. He knelt down, lowering himself to the homeless man's level. Silence stretched between them as Shaq extended the coat, offering it with quiet certainty. No words, just the act itself. The man hesitated, his fingers twitching against his knee. His eyes, deep set, rimmed with exhaustion, locked onto Shaq's face, and for the first time something flickered behind them. A recognition. A memory. Shaq noticed it immediately. The man wasn't just reacting to kindness. He was reacting to him. But before Shaq could say anything, a sharp laugh cut through the moment. Preston Hawthorne. Are you serious? Preston's voice rang out, dripping with amusement. He stepped forward, shaking his head, looking around as if expecting someone to validate his disbelief. This is your big move? Giving away a coat? What do you think this is? Some heartwarming movie moment? A few onlookers chuckled nervously, but no one spoke. No one agreed. Shaq didn't react. He stayed crouched, his attention still locked onto the homeless man, waiting for him to take the coat. But the man didn't reach for it. Instead, he stared. Not at the coat. At Shaq. A second passed. Then another. And then, "You," the man whispered. The sound of it sent a ripple through Shaq's chest. There was something familiar in that voice. Not the tone, not the rough edges of hardship, but something buried beneath it. Preston scoffed. Oh, great. Now he's talking in riddles. But Shaq ignored him. His focus didn't waver. He tilted his head slightly, scanning the man's features, searching for something, anything that would click into place. The longer he looked, the stronger the feeling grew. He knew this man, or at least he had known him. Do I know you? Shaq asked finally, his voice steady. The homeless man exhaled sharply, as if the words had knocked the wind out of him. His fingers twitched again, this time clenching into a loose fist before relaxing. For a moment it looked like he might answer. But then, just as quickly, his expression shuddered. No, he said, looking away. You don't. A lie. Shaq could hear it. Could feel it. Preston laughed again, louder this time, nudging one of the fallen coins with the toe of his shoe. See? This is why you don't waste your time on people like this, Shaq. They're not grateful. They don't even want help. They just want attention. Shaq slowly stood up, his broad frame casting a shadow over Preston. Is that what you think this is? Shaq asked, his voice calm but weighted. A game for attention? Preston smirked, crossing his arms. Oh, don't get all noble on me. You really think giving away a coat changes anything? You're just playing the role of the big-hearted millionaire, making yourself feel better for a few minutes before you go back to your penthouse. Shaq's jaw tightened, but he didn't take the bait. Instead, he turned back to the homeless man, the sense of familiarity gnawing at him. He had seen that face before. But where? The man shifted under Shaq's gaze, his shoulders curling inward slightly. He looked like someone trying to make himself smaller, trying to disappear into the cracks of the city. But it was too late for that. Shaq wasn't going to let this moment pass. He crouched again, keeping his voice low, just for the two of them. You know me, he said, certainty replacing the question. And I know you. I just don't remember from where. The man swallowed hard, his fingers flexing. It doesn't matter. It does. The man's breathing had changed. It was shallower now, quicker. He was uneasy. And that only confirmed what Shaq already knew. There was a connection here, buried under years of silence. Shaq didn't press, didn't demand answers. Instead, he did the only thing that made sense. He placed the coat gently over the man's shoulders. It dwarfed him. The sleeves were too long, the fit all wrong. But that didn't matter. It wasn't about the fabric or the brand stitched inside the lining. It was about worth. About reminding a man the world had forgotten that he was still human. The homeless man tensed beneath the weight of it. Not because it was heavy, but because it meant something. For a long time, he didn't move. Then finally he pulled the coat tighter around himself. Not a grand gesture. Not a movie moment. Just something real. Shaq stood up again, exhaling slowly. What's your name? The man hesitated, then just above a whisper. Warren. It hit Shaq like a slow-moving wave, washing over him in pieces. Warren. The name stirred something deep in his memory, but the puzzle wasn't complete yet. It was there, just out of reach. Shaq nodded, rolling the name over in his mind. Warren, he repeated, testing it. You ever need anything, you find me. Warren looked up at him then, something unreadable in his expression. Something that looked a lot like regret. Shaq didn't push further. He just gave him a small nod before turning to leave. But before he could take a step, Preston let out an exaggerated sigh. All right, I think we've had enough of this feel-good moment. I gotta say, Shaq, I expected more from you. You want to help the world? Do it in a way that actually matters. Throwing a coat over a bum doesn't make you a hero. Shaq turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Preston's with an intensity that made the air shift. You don't get it, do you? Shaq said, his voice calm but sharp enough to cut. Preston chuckled, feigning innocence. Oh, please, enlighten me. Shaq took a step closer, and for the first time, Preston actually tensed. It's not about money, Shaq said. It's not about fixing people. It's about seeing them. Preston's smirk wavered. Just for a second. But Shaq caught it. He didn't wait for a response. He didn't need one. Instead, he turned back to Warren one last time. I'll see you again, Shaq said, more a promise than a statement. Warren didn't reply, but this time, he didn't look away. As Shaq walked off, the city noise rushed back in, swallowing the moment whole. But something had changed. For the first time in a long time, Warren wasn't invisible. And deep in the back of Shaq's mind, memories stirred. Because the name Warren wasn't just familiar. It was part of a story Shaq hadn't finished yet. A story that wasn't over, not even close. Shaq couldn't shake the feeling. Even as he walked away, even as the city swallowed the moment behind him, something lingered. Warren. The name settled in the back of his mind, familiar but misplaced, like an old song he couldn't quite remember the lyrics to. The way Warren looked at him, wary, guarded, but not unfamiliar, it meant something. Shaq had learned to trust his instincts a long time ago, and right now they were screaming that this wasn't just another chance encounter. Something deeper was buried beneath the surface. But what? The memory was there. He could feel it, just out of reach. And then, Warren. The name wasn't coming from his own thoughts anymore. It was real, spoken aloud. Shaq turned sharply, his heart slamming once against his ribs. Warren was staring at him, still sitting on the curb, still wrapped in the coat Shaq had given him. But now his face had changed. Not in expression, but in depth. It was like something inside him had cracked open, letting old ghosts slip through. And then, just above a whisper, "You don't remember, do you?" The world around them seemed to shrink. The sounds of the city faded into the background, muffled and distant. Shaq took a step closer, his breath slowing. Remember what? Warren exhaled a short, bitter laugh. His fingers clenched the coat tighter around him. Figures, he muttered. You got too big, too far from it. Something cold curled in Shaq's chest. From what? From where? But before he could ask, Warren muttered something else. A single name. And Shaq froze. The past hit him like a train. The rain had been relentless that night, the kind that soaked straight to the bone and turned every breath into mist. The city had felt different then. Harsher, meaner. Or maybe that was just how Shaq saw it at the time. Because back then, he had nothing. The world hadn't known his name yet. There were no million-dollar deals, no suits tailored to perfection, no cameras flashing in his direction. There was just him, and survival. And he had been losing. His fingers had been numb as he gripped his hoodie tighter around himself, his shoes soaked through from stepping into puddles he couldn't afford to care about. His stomach had been empty, twisting in on itself, but that was nothing new. Hunger had been a familiar companion. He remembered standing under the awning of a rundown corner store, watching the world move past him, fast and indifferent. He had been tired, not just physically, but in a way that reached deeper. He had been one wrong step away from giving up. And then, a hand. Not outstretched in pity, not offering charity, but simply holding something out. A sandwich, wrapped in foil, slightly crushed but real. solid. Shaq had looked up and met the eyes of the man offering it to him. He hadn't been much older than Shaq at the time, mid-30s maybe, but he had carried himself like someone who had already seen everything. He had a face lined with struggle, but not defeat. "Eat," the man had said simply. No speeches, no expectations. Shaq had hesitated, pride warring with desperation. But in the end, hunger had won. He had taken the sandwich. And that night, for the first time in weeks, he hadn't gone to sleep hungry. Shaq's breath was unsteady. The memory had slammed into him so hard, so fast, it left him momentarily off balance. It was him, Warren. 15 years had changed them both. Life had carved new lines into their faces, added weight to their shoulders, altered the circumstances of their existence. But it was him. Warren had been the one to help him, and now, Shaq was the one standing over him. Warren watched the realization dawn in Shaq's eyes, the recognition hitting like lightning. He let out a small, humorless chuckle. "There it is," he muttered. "Took you long enough." Shaq swallowed hard, emotions crashing against him in waves. "You—" His voice caught. He exhaled sharply, trying to steady himself. I didn't know." Warren shrugged, but the movement was heavy. "Why would you? You moved up, got out. People don't look back when they make it." Shaq felt that, deep. Because Warren wasn't wrong. The world taught you to keep moving forward, to leave the past where it belonged. Success was about distance. Distance from struggle, from pain, from the places you used to be. But right now, standing here, looking at Warren, Shaq realized something. Maybe some distances weren't meant to exist. "You saved me," Shaq said, the words feeling strange in his mouth, like they had been waiting to be spoken for years. Warren let out another short laugh, shaking his head. "I gave you a sandwich, man. That ain't saving." But Shaq knew better, because that night had been a turning point. That small act of kindness had been the first crack in the hopelessness Shaq had been drowning in. It had been proof. Proof that the world still had good in it. Proof that he wasn't completely invisible. And now, all these years later, Warren was the one drowning. Shaq felt a lump rise in his throat, the weight of everything pressing down on him at once. How had it come to this? How had Warren ended up here, forgotten and broken, while Shaq had risen so far? He clenched his jaw, pushing back the emotions threatening to unravel him. This wasn't the time for guilt. It wasn't the time for apologies. It was the time for action. Shaq took a slow breath, steadying himself. When he spoke again, his voice was firm. "You're coming with me." Warren blinked, caught off guard. "What?" Shaq didn't waver. "I'm not walking away from you. Not this time." Warren frowned, shaking his head. "Shaq, No." Shaq cut him off, his tone final. "I don't care what you have to say. I don't care how much pride you've got left. You helped me when I had nothing, and now it's my turn." Warren exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Man, it's not that simple." "It is," Shaq countered. "You're getting up, you're coming with me, and we're figuring this out." Silence stretched between them. For a long moment, it seemed like Warren might refuse, like he might dig his heels in, let pride or exhaustion win. But then, he nodded. Just barely. Just enough. Shaq didn't hesitate. He reached down and helped Warren to his feet. The city kept moving around them. Life went on, oblivious. But for them, for Shaq and Warren, something had just shifted. And this time, Shaq wasn't leaving anyone behind. Preston still wore that smug expression, the one that said he believed he had already won. That moment, this exchange, was just another instance of him asserting dominance over people he deemed beneath him. He didn't notice the shift, didn't see the way bystanders had stopped to listen, didn't realize that for the first time in his life, he wasn't the loudest voice in the room. He glanced at Warren, still wrapped in Shaq's expensive coat, and scoffed. "So what's the plan here, Shaq? You gonna take him home, give him a makeover, make him the next rags-to-riches success story? Is that the fantasy we're playing out?" Shaq didn't react, didn't rise to the bait. He had dealt with men like Preston before, men who confused loudness with power. He just looked at him, calm, steady, and spoke. "You always this insecure, Preston?" The question was simple, quiet, but it landed. Preston's smirk twitched, just for a second before returning. "Excuse me?" Shaq shrugged, his voice even. "You seem real invested in proving something today." He glanced at the fallen coins still scattered on the sidewalk. "And it's not working." Preston let out a short, forced chuckle. "Oh, come on. Let's not pretend like this is anything other than what it is. You're making a scene. You want to play hero, and these people," he gestured at the small crowd forming, "are eating it up." Shaq tilted his head slightly. "And what are you doing?" Preston's mouth opened, but no words came. Shaq took a slow step forward, and for the first time, Preston stepped back. Just an inch, just a fraction of movement. But it was enough. The power had shifted. The air around them felt different now. The people watching weren't just bystanders anymore. They were witnesses. And that was when Warren spoke. His voice was low, but sharp, like a whisper that still managed to cut through the noise. "You want to talk about heroes, Preston?" Preston barely spared him a glance. "Oh, please don't start." "I remember you." The words weren't loud, but the way Warren said them, they stopped Preston cold. The smirk vanished. The mask cracked. Just for a moment. Shaq saw it. Everyone saw it. Warren didn't look away. Didn't lower his voice. Didn't shrink under Preston's presence the way so many others had. "I used to work for you," Warren said. Preston let out a breath that was almost a laugh, but it didn't carry the same arrogance as before. "That so?" "Yeah." Warren nodded, his grip tightening on the coat Shaq had given him. "A long time ago, before everything fell apart." Preston shook his head, forcing the smirk back onto his face. "You expect me to remember every guy who couldn't hack it in the business world? You expect me to care?" The crowd around them had grown now. People weren't just watching. They were recording. Phones were raised, camera lenses focused. And then, Warren said something that changed everything. "You're still cooking the numbers, aren't you?" The street noise didn't stop. But somehow, it felt like it did. Shaq saw it immediately. The way Preston's expression dropped. For the first time, Preston looked afraid. He recovered quickly, rolling his eyes. "Oh, wow. And now we're making up conspiracy theories? That's rich." But Warren wasn't done. He took a step forward, and Preston stepped back again. "You think I don't remember how you operated?" Warren's voice was quiet, but every word hit like a hammer. "You had whole teams forging reports, overcharging investors, bleeding companies dry before pulling out at the last second. How many people lost their jobs because of you?" Shaq could feel the shift in the air. Preston's mouth opened, closed. He looked around as if trying to gauge how many people were actually listening. Too many. Far too many. And then, a voice from the crowd. "Wait. I heard about that." It was a younger man holding up his phone, his brow furrowed as he scrolled through something. "Hawthorne Financial. There was a whole Reddit thread about this. People were saying shady stuff was going down, but no one ever had proof." Warren let out a slow, mirthless laugh. "You want proof? Look at his face." Every camera in the crowd turned toward Preston. He tried to smile, tried to salvage this moment, but there was panic in his eyes now. Shaq just watched, saying nothing. He didn't have to. Preston was unraveling on his own. "This is ridiculous," Preston said, straightening his tie. "Some washed-up nobody spewing lies and you all just believe him?" He gestured at Warren, scoffing. "The guy's homeless. You really think he's got credible information?" It was the wrong thing to say, because the crowd didn't react the way Preston expected. No laughter, no agreement, just cold, hard silence. And then, the cameras started flashing. Shaq saw it happen in real time. The moment Preston lost control. People were typing, whispering, recording. Social media wasn't waiting for confirmation. The narrative was already forming. And Preston could see it. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the one writing the story. Shaq took a slow step forward, his voice calm. "What's wrong, Preston?" Preston turned, rage flickering behind his eyes. You think you're better than me? Shaq didn't answer right away. He just studied Preston, as if really seeing him for the first time. And then, he said it. I think you're scared. Preston stilled. Shaq continued, his voice even. I think you've spent your whole life trying to make people feel small, because if you weren't standing on top of someone else, you'd have to face the truth. Preston swallowed. Which is? You're not as powerful as you think. The words landed like a strike to the gut, because Preston knew it was true. And now? So did everyone else. His reputation wasn't bulletproof. His money wouldn't erase this moment. People would talk. People would remember. And Preston Hawthorne was falling. Not in a way that was loud. Not in a way that would happen overnight. But the cracks were there. And cracks? They only ever got wider. Shaq turned to Warren, nodding once. Then, without another word, he walked away. The crowd didn't disperse immediately. People were still whispering, still filming, still posting. And Preston? He just stood there. A man watching the empire he built start to crumble. Shaq didn't leave. Even after the cameras stopped flashing, after the murmurs of the crowd faded into the city's endless hum, he stayed. Preston had walked off, his suit crisp but his confidence cracked. The weight of Warren's words still lingered, hanging thick in the air. The power dynamic had shifted, but Shaq knew this wasn't about winning. This wasn't a battle to be fought with money or pride. This was about something deeper. So, instead of disappearing into his world of luxury, he sat down. Right there, on the sidewalk, next to Warren. The move caught Warren off guard. His posture tensed, shoulders curling inward like he wasn't sure if this was real. His whole life had taught him one thing. People like Shaq didn't stay. But Shaq wasn't people. He wasn't here for the show, wasn't here to throw money at a problem and walk away feeling good about himself. He was here because something wasn't finished. You hungry? Shaq asked, his voice calm. Not pitying. Not careful. Just real. Warren glanced at him sideways, his fingers tightening around the edges of the coat Shaq had given him. For a moment, it seemed like he wouldn't answer. Then, finally, Nah, Warren muttered. Not now. Shaq nodded, accepting the answer. He didn't push. He just leaned back against the rough brick wall behind them, stretching his legs out. The city moved around them, fast and relentless. But for this moment, they were still. Warren let out a slow breath, staring ahead at nothing. His fingers traced the seam of the coat, absently, like he wasn't used to having something his own. You really don't remember, do you? He asked. Shaq exhaled through his nose, running a hand over his jaw. I remember now. His voice was quieter, heavier. 15 years ago. The sandwich Warren gave a short, dry laugh. Yeah, guess I did my one good deed for the decade. Shaq turned his head slightly, studying him. That why you don't want help? Warren shook his head. I don't want charity. Shaq didn't react, didn't argue, because he understood, more than Warren realized. I get that, Shaq said after a pause. I do. Warren's brow furrowed slightly. Do you? Shaq's lips pressed together. The memories weren't easy. They weren't something he shared. But if anyone deserved the truth, it was Warren. I wasn't always this guy, Shaq said, gesturing vaguely to himself. The suits, the money, the cameras, that all came later. His voice dipped lower. Way later. Warren listened, his expression unreadable. There was a time, Shaq continued, when I was just surviving. Didn't know where I was going to sleep half the time, didn't know what was next, and I had to fight, man. Had to fight for every damn thing. He let out a breath, shaking his head slightly. No handouts, no safety net. Just me and whatever I could scrape together. Warren was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, that why you stayed? Shaq turned to him. Warren's grip on the coat tightened slightly. After all that mess with Preston, you could have walked away, but you didn't. His voice was rough, but there was something raw beneath it. Why? Shaq met his gaze, steady. Because the streets remember everything. Warren's breath hitched slightly. Shaq rested his elbows on his knees, glancing out at the city. People like Preston? They think they own the world. that their money protects them. But the streets, they never forget. They never let go. And I don't either. Warren exhaled slowly. His fingers curled into fists, then relaxed. A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, I used to own a business. Shaq turned to him fully. Warren's eyes were distant now, focused on something long gone. I wasn't rich, Warren continued. But I wasn't starving either. Had a small firm, construction consulting mostly. Worked with developers, helped rebuild places that needed it. He let out a breath, shaking his head. It was good. I was good. Shaq could hear the weight behind those words. But then, Warren's voice dropped lower. Preston happened. Shaq's jaw clenched. He was expanding his empire, Warren said bitterly. Had this big plan to push out smaller firms and bring everything under his umbrella. I didn't want in. Didn't want to work for a guy like that. Thought I could stay independent, hold my ground? He scoffed. Stupid. Shaq stayed silent, letting him continue. One day, we got a job bid pulled out from under us. Didn't make sense. We had the best offer, lowest cost, cleanest reputation. But suddenly, boom. Gone. Warren exhaled sharply. Next thing I know, banks start pulling loans. Clients start canceling contracts. My name gets dragged through legal hell for things I didn't even do. His fingers flexed. And guess who bought my company for pennies when it all burned down? Shaq didn't need to guess. Preston. Warren nodded slowly. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. I lost everything. My house. My savings. And once you hit the bottom, it's damn near impossible to climb back up. Shaq could feel the anger settle deep in his bones. He had always known men like Preston were ruthless. But hearing it firsthand, seeing the wreckage left behind, it made it real. And worse, it made sense why Warren refused help. Because it wasn't just about pride. It was about trust. Warren let out a slow breath, shaking his head. I don't need a handout, Shaq. That's not what I'm about. Shaq studied him for a long moment. Then finally he spoke. I'm not offering charity. Warren frowned slightly. Then what are you offering? Shaq leaned in, his voice firm. A way back. Warren hesitated. Shaq wasn't talking about money. He wasn't talking about some empty favor. He was talking about something real. Dignity. Purpose. A second shot. Warren's breath was unsteady. He looked down at the coat, as if seeing it differently now. And then, for the first time in years, he whispered, How? Shaq exhaled, something settling inside him. We start small, he said. One step at a time. I got people who can help get you back on your feet. You don't owe me anything. You don't gotta say yes right now, but the door's open. Warren swallowed hard. Shaq let him sit with it. Let him process. Because this wasn't a decision you made lightly. The world had knocked Warren down, buried him. But the streets remembered. And now so did Shaq. So they sat there. Not as a millionaire and a homeless man, but as two men who had once been on the same side of the struggle. And maybe, just maybe, they could rewrite the ending. Preston Hawthorne had spent his whole life believing he was untouchable. Money had always shielded him. Connections had always protected him. No matter how many people he stepped on, no matter how many lives he ruined, he had always come out on top. Until now. Until one moment, one exchange on a busy street corner, changed everything. At first, he didn't notice. He left that sidewalk the same way he had always left places, in control. Or so he thought. It wasn't until later that night, when his phone wouldn't stop buzzing, that he realized something was wrong. It had started as just another clip on social media. Someone in the crowd had recorded the entire confrontation, Preston mocking the homeless man, tossing coins at him, laughing. And then, the moment that changed everything. Warren whispering the truth. You're still cooking the numbers, aren't you? The words had been quiet, but they had cut deep. And now? The internet had heard them loud and clear. By morning, the video had exploded. Thousands of comments, millions of views. People were digging. Shaq watched it unfold without saying a word. He didn't need to. Preston's world starts to crumble. The first crack came from Hawthorne Financial's investors. By noon, reports were circulating, shares dropping, clients backing out. No one wanted their money tied to a man who had just become the face of corporate cruelty. Then came the journalists, digging up old lawsuits, examining shady business practices, looking into exactly how Preston built his empire. And just like that, the empire started shaking. Preston scrambled. He tried damage control, issued a weak apology, blamed misunderstandings. But it was too late. Because once the streets start talking, the world starts listening. While Preston fought to keep his world from falling apart, Shaq focused on something that actually mattered. Warren. Not as some charity case, not as some PR stunt, but as a man who had been wronged. Shaq had money, sure. He had power, influence, connections. But that wasn't what Warren needed. Warren needed a way back. So Shaq did what he did best. He moved without making noise. He made a few calls. Not to hand Warren a new life, but to rebuild the one that was stolen from him. And that's when things got interesting. Because the more Shaq dug, the more he realized something wasn't right. Late one night, Shaq sat in his penthouse, scrolling through an old list of names. It was a roster of businesses, companies that had been swallowed whole by Hawthorne Financial over the years. Some had been merged, some had been shut down, and some had just vanished. And there it was, Weston and Raines Construction. Shaq stared at the name. It was familiar, not just because it was Warren's old firm, but because of something deeper, something buried in his own past. His mind raced back, 15 years ago, the streets, the struggle, the desperation, and the one job offer that never materialized. Back then, Shaq had been searching, not for charity, not for handouts, but for a chance. He had heard about an opportunity, an entry-level position with a construction firm. No degree required, just hard work. Weston and Raines. He had applied. And then, nothing. No callback, no rejection letter, just silence. At the time, he had assumed it was bad luck, that the door had just closed. But now, looking at this name, Warren's name, Shaq realized something. That door hadn't just closed. It had been slammed shut by Preston Hawthorne. Shaq exhaled, gripping his phone tighter. He had always assumed his life had taken a different path because it was supposed to. But what if that wasn't true? What if he was supposed to have worked for Warren all those years ago? What if he was supposed to have been part of that company? And what if Preston had made sure that never happened? The pieces clicked together, one by one. Weston and Raines had been destroyed because Warren refused to sell out. And Shaq, without even realizing it, had been one of its casualties. His life had turned out differently, sure. But how many others had been erased in the process? Shaq stared at the name, his jaw tightening. Preston had stolen from Warren. But he had also stolen from him. Shaq wasn't a man who believed in revenge. But he did believe in justice. So he did what needed to be done. He called in a favor. A quiet favor. The kind that left no footprints. A few conversations with the right people. A few papers pushed in the right direction. By the time the sun rose, Weston and Raines was back in Warren's name. Not as a favor, not as a handout, but as something that had always belonged to him. And Warren, for the first time in years, he had a choice. Meanwhile, across the city, Preston was drowning. News stations were running segments on the scandal. Former employees were coming forward. The name Hawthorne Financial was becoming toxic. And then, the final blow. An anonymous leak. Documents. Emails. Proof. Of fraud. Of manipulation. Of every dirty deal Preston had ever made. By the time he arrived at his office that morning, his assistant was waiting at the door. "Sir," she said, voice tight. "We have a problem." No, Preston thought numbly. We have an ending. The next morning, Warren stood in front of a building he once owned. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the city. Shaq stood beside him, hands in his pockets, waiting. Warren took a deep breath. He still looked tired, still looked like a man who had seen too much. But he also looked like a man who had one more fight left in him. He turned to Shaq, exhaling slowly. "You didn't have to do this." Shaq nodded. I know. A pause. Then, I don't know if I can do this again, Warren admitted. Starting over. Shaq looked at him steady. You already started. Warren let out a small, almost laugh. Yeah, guess I did. He reached out, resting a hand on the door handle. For the first time in years, the name on the building was his again, and for the first time in even longer, it meant something. The next morning, Shaq returned to the street corner, expecting to see Warren sitting in the same spot. But he was gone. The sidewalk was empty, the space where he had been nothing more than a memory. The coat Shaq had given him was missing too, meaning Warren had taken it with him. That was something, at least. But still, where was he? Shaq turned, scanning the street. A few familiar faces, people who had been watching the events unfold over the last few days, lingered nearby, but no one spoke. No one acknowledged him. It was a reminder. The streets didn't just give up answers. You had to earn them. And Shaq? He wasn't a stranger to that. Across the city, Preston Hawthorne was fighting to breathe. His office was in chaos. Phone calls went unanswered. Clients, his biggest investors, were withdrawing their money. He had tried to get ahead of it, tried to spin the narrative before it could spiral. But the internet didn't care about damage control. The media didn't care about his version of the story. People cared about what they saw. And what they had seen? A wealthy businessman mocking a homeless man. A former employee exposing him. Shaq standing there, watching him fall. The board had called an emergency meeting. The tension in the conference room had been suffocating. One by one, his allies had vanished. Preston had built his career on controlling the flow of money, on making sure he was always one step ahead. But now, the city had turned against him, and there was no coming back from that. Shaq walked through the streets, hands in his pockets, his mind turning over the same thoughts. He had spent years moving forward, building an empire, proving to the world that he belonged among the rich and powerful. But being back here, on the same streets that had shaped him, he realized something. The streets had never left him. He had worn expensive suits, sat in rooms with people who only spoke in numbers and contracts. He had played the game, but deep down, he was still the kid who had fought for every dollar. Still the man who understood what it felt like to be ignored. And the truth? That version of him? It wasn't something money could erase. Shaq didn't expect to see Preston again, didn't expect the man to seek him out. But he did. The meeting wasn't planned. It wasn't orchestrated. It just happened. Shaq had been sitting in a quiet cafe, drinking coffee, lost in thought. And then, out of nowhere, Preston sat down across from him. His suit wasn't as crisp. His expression wasn't as smug. He looked like a man who had been through hell in a matter of days. For the first time, Preston wasn't trying to perform. He was just there. Shaq didn't speak first. He just watched, waiting. Preston exhaled, running a hand through his hair. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, less sure. You happy? Shaq raised an eyebrow. That what you think this is? Some kind of win for me? Preston let out a hollow laugh. I don't know what to think anymore. Silence stretched between them. And then, Shaq told him the truth. You thought money made you untouchable, Shaq said, his voice steady. But money only works when people believe in it. He leaned forward slightly. And right now, no one believes in you. Preston's jaw tightened. Shaq wasn't gloating. He wasn't looking for revenge, but he was looking for understanding. The streets don't forget, Preston, Shaq continued. They don't forgive. You thought you could do whatever you wanted, step on whoever you wanted, and never answer for it. Preston looked away. He had nothing to say. Because he knew. For the first time in his life, he knew what it felt like to have the world turn on him. Shaq leaned back in his chair, studying him. So, what now? Preston let out a slow breath. I don't know. And that was the most honest thing he had ever said. Shaq nodded, standing up. He didn't offer advice, didn't offer pity. He just left Preston there, sitting in the quiet, alone with the truth. Because sometimes, that was punishment enough. Shaq never found Warren again. Days passed, Then weeks. No sign of him. But one day, just when Shaq was starting to think he had disappeared for good, a small crumpled note arrived at his office. No signature, just 4 words. "I'll see you around." Shaq smiled. Because that was enough. Shaq had searched for Warren for days. He had checked the streets, the shelters, the places where forgotten people disappeared between the cracks of the city. But Warren was nowhere. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. And that, more than anything, bothered him. Because Warren wasn't just a man who had lost his way. He was a man with a past that had somehow, someway, intersected with Shaq's own. And Shaq couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he had missed. Something bigger than just the past few days. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. A retired city worker, an old man who had been sweeping the same street corner for decades, recognized Warren's name when Shaq asked about him. "Warren Raines," the man had repeated, pausing with his broom mid-sweep. "I knew a Warren Raines, but not like how you saw him." Shaq frowned. "What do you mean?" The old man leaned on his broom, sighing. He used to be somebody. Not just a businessman, a builder, a man who put things together when the rest of this city was falling apart. Shaq listened, his chest tightening. "But then," the man continued, "he disappeared. Word was, he got swallowed up by the system. Someone took everything from him. Guess you already know that part." Shaq nodded slowly. "But there's something you might not know," the old man said, lowering his voice slightly. "Before he was Warren Raines the businessman, he was Warren Raines the fighter." Shaq's breath caught. The fighter. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. A memory, years old, buried deep, surfaced in his mind. The gym had smelled like sweat and sawdust, the kind of place built for work, not comfort. Shaq had been younger then, still trying to figure out his place in the world. And there had been one man who had pushed him harder than anyone. A trainer who never cared about his size, his strength, or his potential. A trainer who had only cared about his heart. "You think muscles make you a man?" The man had stood with his arms crossed, eyes sharp as steel. "They don't. What you do when everything's on the line, that's what makes you." Warren. Shaq's stomach turned. The man who had once taught him to fight, not just in the ring but in life, had been right in front of him all along, and he hadn't even recognized him. Shaq stood there, silent, stunned. The old man with the broom watched him carefully. "You knew him, didn't you?" Shaq exhaled slowly. "Yeah, I did." He had owed Warren more than just a thank you. He had owed him his foundation. That night, Shaq found Warren, not on the street, not in a shelter, but on the steps of an old abandoned gym. Warren sat with his back against the wall, Shaq's coat still wrapped around him. His eyes were closed, his breathing steady. He looked at peace. Shaq sat down beside him, mirroring his posture. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Warren let out a small chuckle. "Took you long enough." Shaq shook his head, half in disbelief, half in something heavier. "I didn't recognize you." "I know." The words weren't bitter, they weren't angry. They were just true. Shaq exhaled, staring out at the empty street in front of them. "Why didn't you tell me?" Warren opened his eyes, tilting his head slightly. "Would it have changed anything?" Shaq wanted to say yes, wanted to believe that if he had known sooner things would be different. But the truth? The truth was, Warren had never wanted to be saved. He had just wanted to be seen. "I never forgot what you taught me," Shaq said after a moment. Warren smirked. "Oh yeah? What's that?" Shaq's gaze was steady. "That you don't measure a man by what he has. You measure him by what he can lose and still keep going." Warren nodded slowly, his smirk fading into something softer. Shaq turned to him, voice quiet. "I owe you." Warren let out a slow breath. "No, you don't." Shaq frowned. "Yes, I do." But Warren shook his head. "You don't owe me, Shaq. I didn't help you back then because I wanted something in return. I helped you because somebody once helped me. That's how it works." Shaq felt something tighten in his chest. Some debts couldn't be repaid, only honored. Warren pushed himself up, stretching slightly. Shaq watched him, knowing, somehow, that this was the last time he would see him. Warren turned, hands in his pockets, eyes unreadable. "You did good, kid." Shaq swallowed hard. "So did you." A pause. Then, "You know what to do next, right?" Shaq nodded, though he wasn't sure why. "Yeah." Warren smirked. "Good." And then, just like that, he walked away. No goodbye. No promise to meet again. Just gone. Shaq sat there for a long time after Warren disappeared into the night. He thought about everything, the past, the present, the choices that had led him here. He wasn't a savior. He wasn't some hero fixing the world one lost soul at a time. He was just a man who remembered. A man who knew that the streets didn't just take from you. They gave too. And sometimes, they gave you exactly what you needed to become who you were meant to be. Shaq stood up, shoving his hands in his pockets. The city was still alive, still moving, shifting, breathing. And for the first time in a long time, Shaq knew. This wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about something more. He walked forward, the streetlights casting long shadows behind him. And somewhere in the distance, the city kept watching. Some stories stay with you long after they end. This isn't just about riches and ruin. It's about who we choose to be when no one's watching. The streets don't forget. The question is, will you? Keep your eyes open. The next story might be closer than you think.